Rosalind Brookhaven walked slowly up the wide marble staircase, running her hand along the polished banister. Her heels thudded on the steps, echoing off the high walls. The Georgian-style mansion in the upscale Cold Springs neighborhood was finally hers. 3 floors, 8 bedrooms, a wine cellar, a winter garden, and a swimming pool. Everything she dreamed of for the past 15 years. Pausing at the panoramic window overlooking the manicured garden, Rosie involuntarily recalled her first store on the outskirts of town, a tiny space with a leaky roof and a single fitting room separated by an old curtain. Then, at 27, she had decided to risk it all, investing her grandmother's inheritance in her dream. The first year she worked without a day off, standing behind the counter, hanging the merchandise herself and doing the bookkeeping. She opened her second store 3 years later when she realized that people were willing to drive across town for her unique finds. Rosie always had impeccable taste and was able to find unusual things that turned an ordinary closet into a work of art. By the age of 35, she had a network of 6 boutiques in the best shopping centers in the city, and the magazine Business Today called her a rising star of the fashion industry. "Mrs. Brookhaven," came a voice from behind me. "I've sketched out some options for the living room." Rosie turned around. A young woman in an austere suit held a clipboard with renderings of the interior. Meredith Ashworth was a famous designer, and her appointments were booked 6 months in advance. "Let's take a look." Rosie gestured for the designer to take a seat on the wide windowsill. "I want the house to look elegant but cozy. No cold luxury. I thought about a warm color scheme for the living room." Meredith began to show her designs. Shades of terracotta, gold, deep blue, lots of textiles, natural materials. They spent almost an hour discussing the details of the future interior. Rosie could feel the excitement growing inside. She would finally create the house of her dreams. In the evening, she showed the projects to Ted. Her husband only glanced at the pictures, nodding absent-mindedly. "It looks good," he said indifferently, keeping his eyes on the phone. "Do as you see fit." "But you were the one who insisted on buying such a big house," Rosie reminded him. "You said we needed a place for receptions, for guests." Yes, of course." Ted rose from his chair. "I'm sorry, darling. I have to go to the office. Important meeting with the investors." "At 9 o'clock at night?" Rosie frowned. "You know how it is," he pecked her cheek. "Don't expect me for dinner." It had been happening more and more often the last few weeks. Late meetings, sudden business trips, irritability over the smallest things. Rosie had written it off as stress. Ted was having a difficult time at work. But something subtly changed in their relationship. Left alone, she picked up her husband's cell phone, forgotten on the table. A message popped up on the screen. "Can't wait to see you. S." Rosie froze but then shook her head. There was no telling who it could be. A client, a business partner. A week later, the move began. The movers scurried between the vans, moving boxes and furniture. Rosie managed the process, trying to keep track of everything at once. By evening, most of the stuff was unpacked, and she and Ted opened champagne in the new living room. "To the new house," Ted said, raising his glass. Rosie heard a strange intonation in his voice, but she put it down to tiredness after a hard day. "To a new life," she said, not realizing how prophetic those words would be. Sunset light streamed through the panoramic windows, playing in the facets of the crystal glasses. Rosie looked at her husband, trying to catch his gaze, but Ted was back on the phone, smiling absent-mindedly at some message. The business meeting with the suppliers dragged on longer than usual. Rosie was driving tiredly down the driveway to the house when she noticed 2 unfamiliar cars, a silver Lexus and a red Mercedes of the latest model. They were parked right in front of the front door, as if their owners planned to stay for a long time. Something unpleasant prickled under his heart. In the 2 weeks they'd been in the new house, they hadn't had any guests yet. Only the designer and the workmen showed up regularly. As Rosie parked, she saw the familiar tall figure of her mother-in-law flash through the window. In the spacious hallway, she was greeted by an unusual noise. The sound of furniture being moved, loud voices, and a woman's laughter that was definitely not that of Beatrice Brookhaven. Rosie came up the stairs, taking off her jacket as she went, and stood in the doorway of the parlor. Beatrice, dressed in an impeccable Chanel suit, was supervising two movers who were trying to move a massive antique armchair by the fireplace. A young blonde in a tight dress stood next to her, commenting animatedly. Ted watched with a satisfied smile. "What's going on here?" Rosie's voice sounded sharper than she wanted it to. "Oh, darling." Ted came over to her, trying to hug her. "Mom had a little accident. A pipe burst in her house. I had to make some emergency repairs, so I offered to let her stay with us for a while." "Who's that?" Rosie nodded toward the blonde, who was now looking at her with undisguised curiosity. "Savannah Goldsmith. She works with me," Ted said casually. "She was kind enough to help my mom with the move." "Savannah and I have been inseparable lately," Beatrice cooed. "She's such a sweet girl. She's a godsend." Rosie watched in silence as the movers brought in more and more boxes, bags, and suitcases. There was a suspiciously large amount of luggage for a temporary residence. Dinner turned into a real ordeal. Martha, Rosie's housekeeper, served baked salmon with vegetables and white wine. "I'm afraid this wine is too young," Beatrice frowned, barely tasting her glass. "I have a fine Chablis from the 2000th year in my cellar. It's a pity it's still there." "The service leaves a lot to be desired," she continued, eyeing the table critically. "In a decent house, they put dessert spoons on the table." "Mom," Ted interrupted her gently, "let's not bore Rosie with such trivialities." Savannah sat to Ted's right, leaning toward him now and then, ostensibly to whisper something. Her perfume, too sweet and cloying for business style, filled the entire dining room. After dinner, Rosie went upstairs to her bedroom, trying to cope with her growing anxiety. Ted showed up an hour later. "We need to talk," Rosie began. "How long is this going to go on? And why did your mother bring half the house with her?" "For God's sake, Rosie," Ted exploded. "The house is huge. Can't you bear it for a few weeks? Or do you feel sorry for my mother's space?" "It's not about space. Why didn't you discuss this with me beforehand? And what is Savannah doing here?" "I told you, she's helping my mom." Ted's voice turned threatening. "What's your problem? Maybe you're jealous." "Don't be silly," Rosie tried to keep calm. "I just want to understand." "There's nothing to understand." Ted cut her off. "This is my house as much as it is yours, and I have the right to invite whoever I want to come here." He walked out, slamming the door loudly. Rosie stood at the window, staring out into the darkness. Savannah's laughter and Beatrice's voice came from downstairs, giving orders to the servants. There seemed to be no room for her in their new home. That night, Ted never returned to the bedroom. Rosie lay awake, replaying the day's events in her head. Something told her this was only the beginning. The morning began with the sound of furniture being moved. Rosie came downstairs and stood in the doorway to the living room as two of Beatrice's hired workers moved the antique sofa she and her designer had so carefully chosen for the room. "Mom, what's going on?" Rosie tried to speak calmly. "Oh, darling." Beatrice took a break from supervising the process. "I've decided to freshen things up a bit. This sofa will look much better by the window, and she grumbled, "this is a modern piece of furniture." She frowned. "We'll send that modern piece of furniture down to the cellar, and those abstract paintings don't go with the classical interior at all." By evening, the living room had changed subtly. Gone were all the modern elements of decor, and heavy velvet drapes and massive candlesticks had appeared. Beatrice looked at the result of her labors with triumph. "At least we can have some decent people in here now," she said. Meanwhile, Savannah was settling into the best guest room, which overlooked the garden. Rosie planned to make this room her study for sketching, as it had perfect light. "I hope you don't mind," Savannah murmured, hanging her designer clothes in the closet. Ted said this was the most comfortable room. Of course Ted did. He'd been saying a lot of things in general lately, but not to his wife. More and more often, Rosie found him in the home office with Savannah, leaning over some paperwork, and the conversation died down as soon as she entered. Martha, Rosie's housekeeper, who had worked with her since the first store, was wary. "In a decent house, dinner is served at 2 o'clock, not 1 o'clock like in a diner," she said through gritted teeth. "This silver needs polishing every week. You don't know how to set a table at all." One morning, Rosie heard her mother-in-law reprimanding Martha in the kitchen. "I'll talk to my son about your dismissal. We need more qualified servants." "Mrs. Brookhaven," Martha replied calmly. "I work for Mrs. Rosalind, not for you." Beatrice glowered. "We'll fix that soon enough." Rosie couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere in the house was changing. Ted and Savannah exchanged long glances at lunch, their fingers accidentally touching while passing salt. As they worked in the study, muffled laughter came from behind the door. The denouement came during Sunday lunch, to which Beatrice had invited several of her friends. Rosie sat at the head of the table, feeling like a stranger in her own home. "Ted, darling," Savannah cooed, "you must try this soufflé. I made it to a special recipe." "Since when do you cook in my kitchen?" Rosie blurted out. There was an awkward silence. "Honey," Ted put his hand on his wife's shoulder, "you've been a little tense lately. Maybe you should get some rest." "Oh, yes," Beatrice said, glancing meaningfully at her friends. "You know, my cousin Agatha had a wonderful vacation in a specialized clinic. They help with emotional instability." "What do you mean?" Rosie got up from the table slowly. "It's just that you've become so suspicious, darling," her mother-in-law continued in a husky voice. "Seeing conspiracies everywhere, picking on poor Savannah, who somehow lives in my house and flirts with my husband." Rosie threw her napkin on the table. "See?" Beatrice fluttered her arms in a martial manner. "What a fantasy! Ted, honey, you need to think seriously about your wife's health," the guests murmured. Savannah lowered her eyes, hiding a satisfied smile. Ted looked annoyed. "Rosie, stop making a scene." She walked out of the dining room, feeling the stares. As she walked up the stairs, Rosie heard Beatrice saying to one of the guests, "My poor boy. I always said that woman was no match for him. And now these oddities." In the bedroom, Rosie went to the window. Down in the garden, Ted was talking quietly with Savannah, standing suspiciously close to her. The young woman put her hand on his shoulder, and he didn't pull away. This was no longer just a turf war. It was the war of her life, and Rosie was beginning to realize she was losing. While sorting through papers in her office, Rosie came across an old photo of her and Ted at a fundraiser for a children's cancer center. 7 years ago. It was the first time she'd been involved in such an event as a sponsor. Her boutiques were starting to make a serious profit, and Rosie had decided it was time to share in the success. Ted showed up in the middle of the evening, tall, elegant, in an impeccably tailored tuxedo. He stood out among the other guests with a certain confidence and magnetism. When he spoke to her, Rosie was struck by how much he knew about fashion and art. "You are amazing," he said then. "Most entrepreneurs think only of profit, but you create real works of art." Rosie put the photograph aside. Now, looking back, she saw what she hadn't noticed then, how deftly he'd studied her before meeting her, how accurately he'd hit her weaknesses. She'd always suffered from the fact that successful businessmen didn't take fashion seriously. Their romance had developed rapidly. Ted showed up with flowers in her boutiques, arranged surprises, took her to small picturesque towns for weekends. He charmed her employees, charmed her friends, Only Martha once said, "There's something about him, playful Miss Rosie. But who listens to the housekeeper when they're in love?" 6 months later, he proposed in the same hall where they'd met. A huge diamond ring, orchestra, champagne, enthusiastic guests, just like in the movies. And then Beatrice showed up. Rosie remembered their first meeting, a cold look, a barely perceptible smile. "Ted, honey, are you sure? I mean, she's from a simple family, and those stores of hers." "Mom, times have changed," Ted replied. "Rosie has a wonderful business." That phrase sounded very different now. A week before the wedding, Beatrice invited her to tea. Rosie still remembered every word. "Darling, I've been doing a little research. You know Ted had a fiancée, don't you? A beautiful girl from a good family. She was killed in a car accident. Ted was inconsolable. Maybe you're just a way for him to forget?" Rosie didn't believe it. And now, looking through old newspapers, she couldn't find a single mention of the tragedy. What she did find was Ted's 3 divorces, each time to successful businesswomen. And each time, after the divorce, the business had been taken over by him. In the present, the phone rang. The bank wanted to know when she planned to make a payment on her loan. What loan? Rosie went cold. In her desk drawer were the documents she'd found this morning, 3 large loans in her name made over the past year. The signatures looked like her own. A memory surfaced. 6 months ago, Ted had brought some papers when she'd been busy preparing a deposition. "Honey, just sign it. It's for the IRS. You trust me, don't you?" And then the business trip started. Strange calls, messages that he hastily erased, evening meetings with investors. She put it down to his work, stress, whatever. Before the wedding, Beatrice gave it another try. "You need a prenup, dear. You realize our family has to be protected." "Protected from what?" Rosie was indignant then. "From my money." "From your mistakes," Beatrice cut off. Ted stood up for his fiancée, reprimanded her mother. And now, Rosie was sitting in an empty office looking at the loan documents and putting together a mosaic. Everything had been planned from the beginning. A charity event, the perfect place to meet a wealthy woman, exploring her weaknesses, a beautiful affair. Beatrice playing the part of the evil mother-in-law so Ted could show his devotion to his fiancée. Gradually taking control of the finances. A fake mistress and an oppressive mother who should drive her to a breakdown. And then a divorce due to her instability. And all assets coming under the control of a caring husband who was trying to save his wife's business. Savannah's laughter echoed downstairs. How blind do you have to be to not see the obvious? Rosie took out her phone and dialed the number of her lawyer. "I need an urgent consultation. It's about document fraud." It was time to start her own game. First, her favorite brooch, a vintage dragonfly with emerald wings, a gift from her grandmother, was missing. Rosie remembered leaving it on her dressing table, but the brooch was gone. 3 days later, the jewelry was found in the laundry basket. "You just forgot where you put it," Ted shrugged. "You've been so absent-minded lately." Then the important boutique documents disappeared, the quarterly reports she'd prepared for the board of directors. Rosie turned her office upside down, but the folder seemed to have vanished. "Honey," Ted spoke to her like a sick child, "we talked about this yesterday. You gave the file to Savannah to give to accounting." "What? You don't remember?" He sounded worried. "It was at breakfast. Savannah, confirm." "Of course," the young woman smiled. "You insisted, Mrs. Brookhaven." Rosie could have sworn it was nothing of the sort. But Ted and Savannah seemed so convinced. The next day she heard the maid whispering to the cook, "Mrs. Beatrice says she has memory lapses." Poor Mr. Ted, what's it like with a wife like that? Rumors spread like poison through their social circle. Beatrice did her best. At the charity reception, Rosie noticed how people averted their eyes, whispered behind her back. "They say she's lost her grip on reality," she heard herself say. Can you imagine accusing this nice girl, Savannah, of having an affair with her husband? Meanwhile, Savannah was mocking him, her hands accidentally touching Ted's shoulders, leaning too close to him, laughing at his every joke. "You're confused, Mrs. Brookhaven," she said innocently when Rosie tried to make a remark. "Maybe you're imagining things." Even the arrangement of things in the house was changing. Rosie would leave the room for 5 minutes, come back, and find the pictures hanging differently, the vases in different places. When she asked the servants about it, they looked puzzled. "But everything is as usual, ma'am. No one had touched anything." One evening, Martha knocked on her bedroom door. "Miss Rosie, there's something I have to tell you. I overheard a conversation." It turned out that the housekeeper had overheard Beatrice and Savannah talking in the conservatory. "Just a few more weeks," Beatrice said. "When she had lost her self-confidence, Ted would offer her treatment. I have connections at a great clinic." "And if she refuses?" Savannah asked. "Then we have dirt. Those loans, her erratic behavior. Any court would declare her incompetent." Rosie went cold. That night she pulled out a new leather-bound day planner and made the first entry. April 12th. Ted lied about meeting with investors today. I saw his car outside Le Chateau restaurant at 3 in the afternoon, even though he claimed he'd be in the office. She began recording everything, every conversation, every strange incident, every accidental touch Savannah had with Ted. Photographed the arrangement of things in the rooms, turned on the recorder in her phone every time she talked to her husband or mother-in-law. The next day, her favorite Hermes scarf was missing. Rosie smiled and made a new entry in her journal. Now she had proof, and she knew for sure she wasn't going crazy. In the evening, Ted was working in the study with Savannah as usual. Rosie could hear their muffled laughter outside the door. She pulled out her phone and turned on the recording. The game continued, but now she knew the rules too. After talking to Martha about the overheard conversation in the conservatory, Rosie began to look more closely at the servants. Beatrice had turned the entire staff against her with her arrogance and nagging. Gerald Hopkins, an elderly gardener who had worked on the estate before they moved in, approached Rosie himself one morning. "Mrs. Brookhaven, I'm a simple man and I don't meddle in other people's affairs. But you should know that Mr. Ted and this young lady meet at night in the gazebo. I saw them when I was checking the sprinkler system. My wife divorced her first husband because of the same story. I know how it is." That same day, Rosie received a strange phone call. A male voice introduced himself as Patrick Donovan, the former CFO of Ted's company. "I quit 3 months ago," he said. "Couldn't get involved in his schemes anymore. Look, Mrs. Brookhaven, your husband is running an asset scam. He's moving money out through shell companies and shell names, and your name is on the deeds too." They met at a small cafe on the edge of town. Donovan looked nervous, constantly looking around. "Ted is a master of manipulation. He finds successful women, marries them, and then—" He stopped talking. "I can get you the documents, but be careful. He has people everywhere." When Rosie returned home, she found the maid Lucy in tears. Beatrice reprimanded her for allegedly poorly ironed napkins. "She's unbearable," she sobbed. "Demands the impossible, humiliates us." "Hush," Rosie closed the door. "Tell me more." By the end of the week, she had formed a real network of informants. Lucy followed Savannah's movements around the house. James the cook reported on conversations in the kitchen. Chauffeur Michael reported where Ted was going, and often his routes didn't match what he told his wife. But the big hit was Martha's discovery. While cleaning Ted's office, she noticed that one of the panels was pulling away from the wall. Behind it was a stash of documents. "I took pictures on my phone," the housekeeper whispered, handing Rosie a flash drive. "There are some contracts, bank statements." Rosie spent all night studying the documents. The scheme was clear. Ted was methodically transferring her assets to companies under his control, and in a couple of months' time a big deal was planned that would leave her with nothing. Is it just me, or has Mrs. Rosie been acting strangely lately? Beatrice's voice came from the living room. Definitely, Savannah said. She'd been talking to the gardener for an hour yesterday. What could you possibly talk to a maid about? Rosie smiled. Let them think they're cornering her. Let them think she was crazy, losing control. In fact, control was just beginning to return to her. That evening she gathered her secret allies in the gardener's cottage. Gerald, Martha, Lucy, James, Michael. They all hated Beatrice and her arrogance. All saw what was happening to their mistress, and they were all willing to help. We need more evidence, Rosie said. Recordings of conversations, photographs of meetings, documents, anything you can find. I could install cameras in the gazebo, Gerald suggested. I have some left over from my old job at a security firm. And I accidentally found out the password to Mr. Ted's computer, Lucy confessed, embarrassed. He wrote it down on a post-it note. The plan began to take shape. Rosie realized she only had a few weeks before the big deal. But now she wasn't alone. Be careful, she warned her allies. They mustn't suspect anything. When she returned to the house, Ted was working in the study. With him, of course, was Savannah. Everything okay, honey? He asked. You look a little worried. Everything's fine, Rosie smiled. I was just walking in the garden. It's so peaceful. Her smile grew even wider when she saw Savannah furtively wiping a blade of grass from Ted's knee. They thought they were playing with her, but the real game was just beginning. Honey, you look beautiful today, Rosie smiled at Savannah over breakfast. Is that a new dress? The young woman blinked confusedly, not expecting the compliment. Beatrice squinted suspiciously. Yes, thank you, Savannah mumbled. For the past 2 weeks, Rosie had played the humility card flawlessly. She no longer argued, no longer made a scene, sweet-talked with her mother-in-law about gardening. Ted was visibly relaxed, less cautious. That's exactly what she wanted. Late that night, when everyone was asleep, Rosie slipped into her husband's study. She'd seen the code to the safe a week ago. Ted always typed it with the same hand, covering it with the other. But if you looked from a certain angle through the mirror, the portable scanner silently read document after document, contracts, bank statements, registration details of shell companies. Rosie worked methodically, returning each paper exactly where it belonged. The next day she met the private investigator in an unremarkable bistro on the other side of town. Marcus Reynolds, an ex-cop, looked like a typical accountant. Gray suit, glasses, unremarkable appearance. I've studied the documents you sent, Mrs. Brookhaven, he said quietly, barely moving his lips. Your husband is a very clever crook, but he has made some mistakes. Reynolds unfolded the laptop. Look, all the shell companies are registered through the same agent. A friend of mine at the IRS can dig deeper. Rosie listened attentively, memorizing the details. At the same time, the detective set up surveillance of Ted and Savannah. Photos of their meetings in restaurants, hotels, joint walks were put in a separate folder. Keep everything in cloud storage, Reynolds advised. Encrypted access. A bank on the other coast opened a new account in the name of a shell company. Rosie gradually transferred money into it in small amounts so as not to arouse suspicion. It's perfectly legal, her lawyer, Jonathan Price, assured her. You have the right to protect your assets, especially given the circumstances. He reviewed the evidence. Fraud, forgery, fraudulent inducement to sign documents. Mrs. Brookhaven, we have a very strong case. But we need more, Rosie objected. I want to be sure. That evening she sat with Ted and Savannah in the living room again, making casual conversation. Ted looked pleased. His plan was working. His wife had finally calmed down. Maybe we could have a little reception next weekend? Rosie suggested. We'll invite your business partners. That's a great idea. Savannah perked up. I'll help with the organization. Of course you will, Rosie thought. And be sure to invite the people Ted needed for his scam. And she'll invite her own, the ones she can show the evidence to. Late at night, locked in the bathroom, Rosie looked at the new photos from the detective. Ted and Savannah are walking out of the Ritz Hotel. He kisses her in the car. She walks into his office late at night. In the next room, Ted was on the phone. Everything is going according to plan. She's completely broken. Rosie smiled at her reflection. If only he knew how wrong he was. The chess game was approaching the end game, and she already saw the way to victory. All that remained was to choose the right moment for the decisive blow. The family dinner began as usual, with Beatrice's nagging at the service and Savannah's condescending glances. But something had changed. Perhaps the young mistress's glass of wine had given her courage, or maybe she was just tired of pretending. Ted, honey, Savannah touched his arm playfully. Remember that restaurant in Venice? We should do it again sometime. Rosie froze with her fork in her hand. Beatrice blotted her lips with a napkin, hiding a satisfied smile. Oh, so? You've been to Venice? Rosie asked, innocently. When? Last month, during my business trip, Ted said defiantly. I think it's time to stop this farce. He leaned back in his chair and put his hand on Savannah's shoulder. You figured it out long ago, haven't you, darling? Beatrice set down her glass. You know, Rosalind, I was against your marriage from the beginning. Ted deserves a woman of his own class, someone young, from a good family. She gave Savannah a meaningful look. And that's why you decided to move her into my house. Rosie was surprised at how calm her voice sounded. Your house? Savannah laughed. Oh, honey, this house hasn't been yours for a long time. Neither are your boutiques. What do you mean? Tell her, darling, Savannah murmured. Stop playing cat and mouse. Ted stepped forward. Remember those documents you signed last year? About transferring the assets to the management company? It's all mine now. But it's my business. I built it from the ground up. Rosie felt her voice shaking. Built it from the ground up? Beatrice intervened. What do you mean? A little store of cheap clothes? It was my son who turned your pathetic shop into a decent business. Mom's right, Ted nodded. You would never have made it this far without my connections and my guidance. Your guidance? Rosie felt a wave of anger rising inside her. You mean the supplier fraud? Or the fake invoices? Ted turned pale. What are you talking about? The documents in your safe, darling. You think I don't know about shell companies? Money laundering? Savannah jumped up. She's delusional. Ted, I told you she's unstable. Unstable? Rosie laughed. How are your previous wives, honey? The ones you gave you a nervous breakdown before you took away their business. Now Savannah turned pale. Which wives? Ted. What is she talking about? Don't listen to her, he said. She's making it up. Beatrice stood up, clenching her fists. Enough! I won't let you sully my son's reputation. Your beautiful son who specializes in marriage scams? Rosie got up too. Who finds successful women, marries them, and then… Shut up! Ted threw the glass at the wall. The shards splattered in all directions. Or what? Rosie hissed. You're going to put me in rehab? Like you were going to? Savannah recoiled. What clinic? Ted, we're not. Shut up too, he shouted at his mistress. You're just part of the plan. Part of the plan. Now it was Savannah's turn to throw the dishes. You promised to marry me. Beatrice clutched at her heart. Ted, what's going on? You said… He said a lot of things, Rosie interrupted. To each of us, didn't you, darling? Ted turned slowly toward her, and in his eyes she saw the cold fury he always hid. You're going to regret this. I will destroy you. I'll take everything, your house, your business, your reputation. Just try it, Rosie smiled. I've got something interesting for the IRS and your investors. Savannah burst into tears. You used me. All this time. Oh, shut up, Beatrice exploded. You think I didn't know who you were? I'm just a money grubber. And you are? Savannah snapped at her. Helping your son cheat women, covering up his dirty deeds. Rosie watched in silence as they pounced on each other. The masks came off, revealing the true faces of the greedy con man, his calculating mistress, and the overbearing mother who would do anything to control her son. I'm filing for divorce, she said calmly. Just try it. Ted stepped toward her. I'll prove you're crazy. I have witnesses, records. I have records too, honey, and documents, and witnesses, including your ex-wives. He froze. You're bluffing. Shall we check it out? Rosie headed for the exit. On the way out, she turned around. By the way, I've blocked all the company's accounts, in case you want to withdraw anything. Out. As she left, she could hear the commotion going on in the dining room. Something had broken. I think it was Beatrice's favorite vase. Savannah screamed betrayal. Ted snapped at her. His mother lamented ingratitude. In her room, Rosie pulled out her phone and dialed. Mr. Price? Here we go. Get the paperwork ready. In the morning, she was going to play the last act, to portray a broken woman begging for forgiveness. Let them think they'd won. Let them relax before the final blow. Rosie went to the window. The lights were still on in the dining room. It looked like the family squabble was still going on. She smiled at her reflection in the glass. The party was almost over. The office of the law firm Price, Goldman and Associates was in an old brick building in the business district. Rosie walked through the back door. They had agreed to confidentiality. In the spacious conference room, her team was waiting for her. Jonathan Price, chief divorce attorney, Sarah Goldman, corporate law specialist, Michael Fisher, tax law expert, and private investigator, Marcus Reynolds. Let's start with the financial side. Sarah laid out the documents. We've traced all of your husband's transactions over the last 3 years. The fraud scheme is obvious. He systematically withdrew assets through shell companies. Michael Fisher showed a complex diagram. Here's the evidence of tax evasion. It's a classic pyramid scheme. Each successive company hides the traces of the previous one. But we found a link. His secretary agreed to testify, Reynolds inserted. She was tired of being an accomplice and afraid of responsibility. Rosie scrutinized the documents. Over the past month, she had become an expert in corporate law and finance. What about the previous victims? She asked. 2 have agreed to testify. Price nodded. The stories are identical. Marriage, gradual seizure of control over the business, psychological pressure, attempts to declare them incompetent. And the 3rd? Still afraid, but we're working on it. We've set up a new corporate structure. All your assets are now protected by a system of trusts. Even if he tries to contest it, it'll take years. The IRS is interested in our records, Fisher added. They'll start an audit at the first sign of trouble. Rosie pulled out her laptop. Here are the recordings of Ted's conversations with Beatrice and Savannah. Here they discuss my isolation plan at the clinic. Great, Price made notes. This confirms the conspiracy. Now the important thing is, when do we strike? There's a board meeting next week, Rosie smiled. Ted's planning a big deal, ostensibly a merger with an international company. It's actually the last stage of his scheme. It's perfect timing, Sarah nodded. All the key players will be in place. And the witnesses will be in place, Reynolds added. I'll arrange for the right people to be present. They had worked out the plan down to the last detail. Everyone knew their role. Documents were ready, witnesses prepared, evidence systematized. What about Savannah? Price asked. She'll be the first to break, Rosie answered confidently. After last night's scandal, she's already on the edge. One little push. And Beatrice? She's too proud to admit defeat, but her reputation in the community. Rosie paused. Let's just say some documents about the origins of the Brookhaven family fortune will be of great interest to the press. The final preparations took another 2 hours. When everyone had gone, Rosie was alone with Price. "Are you ready?" he asked. "It's not going to be easy." "I've been ready for a long time," she answered. "You know, the hardest part was not to fall apart early, smiling at them every day pretending to be weak and scared." "You're a great actress." "I had good teachers," Rosie grinned bitterly. "Ted and his mother taught me a lot of things. For example, that you cannot believe the beautiful words and smiles." She gathered the documents. "Tomorrow, I'll play the role of a broken woman for the last time. And in a week," her eyes sparkled, "a week from now, we'll see who really breaks." Leaving the office, Rosie turned on her phone. 3 missed ones from Ted, a text from Beatrice inviting her to tea, to talk things over, a hysterical call from Savannah. They still thought they were in control. Let them think they were. The evening reception began as usual, with champagne and small talk. Beatrice had ordered the house to be decorated in her own style. Heavy bouquets, antique candelabras, prim service. Rosie stood at the window watching the guests arrive, the cream of local society, Ted's business associates, old friends of the Brookhaven family. Savannah fluttered between the groups of guests in a Valentino dress, an exact copy of the one Rosie had worn to last year's charity ball. She wore a sapphire necklace around her neck, a gift from Ted for their 5th anniversary. "Oh, darling," she chirped as she passed Rosie. "I hope you don't mind me borrowing your jewelry. Ted said you haven't been wearing it lately anyway." In another corner of the living room, Beatrice gathered a group of ladies from the charity committee around her. "Of course, we've all noticed the oddities. Poor Ted, he's been trying so hard to help, but some of the problems require professional intervention." The ladies nodded meaningfully, casting sympathetic glances at Rosie. Ted appeared, accompanied by several businessmen. When he noticed his wife, he put his arm around her shoulders. "Honey, did you remember to take your pills?" he asked loud enough for the others to hear. "You look a little agitated today." "What pills, darling?" Rosie smiled serenely. "Well, the ones Dr. Harris prescribed, of course." He looked meaningfully at his companions. "After your last episode." One of the businessmen hummed understandingly. His wife whispered something in the ear of her neighbor. Both looked at Rosie and shook their heads. By 10 o'clock, the atmosphere was heating up. Savannah sat down defiantly at the piano, the same place where Rosie usually played. Her fingers tentatively touched the keys, extracting fake notes from the Moonlight Sonata. "Isn't she charming?" Beatrice said loudly. "So young, talented. And most importantly, she's perfectly healthy mentally," added one of the guests. Muffled laughter rippled through the room. Rosie sipped her champagne slowly, noting every detail, every look, every whisper. She watched Ted and Savannah exchange secret signs as Beatrice gathered more and more listeners around her. Finally, her mother-in-law tapped her glass. "Dear friends, I have wonderful news." The guests fell silent. Savannah fluttered over to Ted, who put his arm around her waist. "My son has finally met a worthy companion," Beatrice glowed. "As soon as some formalities," she threw an expressive glance at Rosie, "we can celebrate the engagement." The hall erupted in applause. Savannah clung to Ted, flashing her sapphire necklace. The guests rushed to congratulate the happy couple. "Rosie, dear," Beatrice swam up to her sister-in-law, "you do realize that this will be better for everyone, don't you? Ted promised to pay for the best clinic." Rosie looked at her in silence, still smiling. Then she looked at Ted and Savannah, who were accepting congratulations, at the guests who were carefully avoiding her, at her necklace around her rival's neck. "Of course, Mom," she said quietly. "I understand." She set down her glass and headed for the exit. Behind her there was laughter again, someone loudly discussing the poor girl who's out of touch with reality. In her bedroom, Rosie pulled out her phone. "Mr. Price?" "Yes, I'm ready. We start tomorrow." Downstairs, the party continued. Music was playing, glasses were clinking. Savannah was laughing falsely at Ted's jokes. Rosie went to the window and looked at her reflection. The smile was gone. A cold glint appeared in her eyes. Tomorrow they would find out who had really lost touch with reality. Rosie woke up early. The house was silent. Last night's reception had dragged on past midnight and everyone was still asleep. Only Martha was in the kitchen. "Mr. Ted has gone to an important meeting," the housekeeper whispered. And Mrs. Beatrice had taken Miss Savannah to pick out an engagement dress. Rosie smiled. "Good. Let's get started." An hour later, 3 vans pulled up to the back door. The moving crew worked quickly and smoothly. Reynolds had recommended reliable people. "Start with Savannah's room," Rosie ordered. All her stuff in the first van. Designer dresses, shoes, handbags went into boxes. Cosmetics, jewelry, personal items followed. In the dressing table drawer, Rosie found her necklace. She carefully put it in the safe. Beatrice's room emptied next. The antique furniture her mother-in-law had brought with her, the antique paintings, the china collection, everything went into the second van. "Take Miss Savannah's things to her apartment," Rosie ordered the driver of the first van, "and Mrs. Beatrice's things to her mansion. And yes, the mansion where the pipe supposedly burst. I checked, it's perfectly fine." At 1 o'clock, the locksmiths showed up. They changed the locks on all the doors, including the back door and the garage. Security came in to reprogram the alarm system and install new cameras. "The perimeter is under control," the head of security reported. "My men will be on duty around the clock." At 3 o'clock, Rosie opened her laptop and sent the first set of documents to the IRS. Evidence of fraud, forged contracts, asset withdrawal schemes. Everything flew to the appropriate authorities. Next was a call to the lawyer. "Mr. Price, send the divorce papers. And yes, have a courier deliver a copy to Ted's office." At 4 o'clock, the first call came. Beatrice screamed into the phone. "How dare you throw away my stuff? Do you have any idea how much this furniture is worth?" "Your things are not thrown out, they are delivered to your house," Rosie calmly replied. "By the way, how are the repairs after the burst pipes?" At 5, a sobbing Savannah called, "You can't do this. Ted loves me." "Of course he does, just like the last 3 wives. By the way, you can ask him about Elizabeth Carter. She really wants to meet you." At 6 o'clock, a furious Ted arrived. Guards blocked his way. "This is my house," he shouted. "I'll sue you. I will destroy you." Rosie went out on the balcony. "Your lawyer already has the divorce papers. So do the copies at the IRS. By the way, did the D.A. office call you?" "You're bluffing." But there was a note of panic in his voice. "Check your email, darling. And yes, can you explain to your investors where their money went? They got some interesting documents, too." Ted turned pale. "You wouldn't dare." "I already have. Now get off my property or security will call the police." By evening, the house was quiet. The old furniture was back where it belonged. Rosie sat in the living room, sipping wine and listening to her favorite sonata. The phone was ringing off the hook. Ted, Beatrice, Savannah, their lawyers. She didn't answer. All communications now went through Mr. Price. At 9 p.m., a message came in from Detective Reynolds. "IRS has started an audit. Investors are demanding an audit. 2 boards of directors are convening emergency meetings." Rosie smiled. The first act of revenge was complete. Tomorrow the second would begin, when the newspapers got the story of how respected businessman Theodore Brookhaven and his mother had been running marriage scams for years. And the day after tomorrow, Savannah finds out she's not the first love of her life in the scheme. But that's another story. The police arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning. Ted, clearly intoxicated, tried to climb over the fence. Security called a patrol. "This is my house," he shouted as the officers politely but firmly put him in the squad car. "You can't keep me out." "Yes, they can," Rosie replied calmly from the balcony. "All the deeds to the house are in my name. By the way, thanks for signing the deed of gift last month. Remember? Just tax optimization, dear." The next morning, the lawyers showed up. Ted had hired a whole team. They threatened lawsuits, demanded compensation, waived lawsuits. "Please," Rosie pointed to a thick folder, "here's evidence of fraud over the last 5 years. Would you like to discuss them in court?" One of the lawyers ran his eyes over the documents. "Mr. Brookhaven, we need to talk privately." At noon, Savannah called. "I have some dirt on you. If you don't pay up, I'm going to tell everyone about your vendor fraud." "Those frauds that Ted organized using forged documents?" Rosie grinned. "Go ahead. Just so you know, your signature is on half of those documents. Do you want to discuss this with the IRS?" The phone went silent. By evening, the heavy artillery had arrived. Mutual friends, business partners, members of charity committees. They all tried to talk some sense into Rosie. "Think of the family's reputation. These cases are handled quietly. Maybe we should compromise?" Rosie silently turned on the tapes of the conversations. One by one, the do-gooders retreated, mumbling apologies. The next day, the trial began. Ted looked confident. He was used to winning these trials. "Your Honor, my wife is mentally unstable. I have a doctor's report, the same Dr. Harris who wrote false reports for your previous wives," Rosie's attorney specified. "Let me present the evidence." By the end of the hearing, Ted's confidence was gone. Beatrice tried to come at it from the other side, through secular society. At a charity event, she loudly discussed this upstart who ruined a beautiful family. "By the way, Mrs. Brookhaven," Rosie said loudly as she walked past, "I've found some interesting documents about the origins of your family fortune. It turns out that your late husband was not only a businessman, but also—" Beatrice stopped short. A week later, she canceled her annual appointment for health reasons. Savannah made one last attempt. "I'm pregnant with Ted's baby. You can't do this to us." "Really?" Rosie raised an eyebrow. "Like Melissa did 2 years ago, and Jane before her? Does Ted pay well for statements like that?" Savannah flew to Europe the next day, taking a decent sum from Ted's secret account. The trial lasted 3 months. Every day, more evidence surfaced: asset fraud, forged documents, testimony from former victims. "You know what the funny thing is?" Rosie said to Ted after the trial. "If you'd just divorce me, I'd give you a nice settlement, but you decided to play your own games." "I will destroy you," he hissed. "Already tried, darling. Any luck?" That evening, she watched the news. On the screen, Ted was handcuffed to a police car. The next story was about the beginning of an investigation into his machinations. Beatrice was hurriedly selling the family mansion and was going to leave to relatives in Europe. Rosie turned off the TV and went to the window. Her cell phone vibrated in her pocket, a message from Martha. "Turn on the news. Savannah is being interviewed, telling all—" She smiled. "Well, time to get ready for the final act of this drama." A folder labeled Case Number 387 lay on the desk of Prosecutor Diane Marshall. The elegant middle-aged woman scrutinized the documents, making occasional notes. "Miss Carter, tell me how it all began," she said to the woman sitting across from her. Elizabeth Carter, Ted Brookhaven's first wife, fidgeted nervously with her handkerchief. "It was 7 years ago. I owned a chain of spas in 3 states. We met at a charity event." The story sounded painfully familiar. A beautiful romance, a quick wedding, a gradual intervention in the business. Beatrice playing the role of overbearing mother-in-law. strange documents to be signed for the IRS, a young assistant showing up at the house. When I started asking questions, they declared me crazy. Elizabeth's voice shook. Some Dr. Harris issued a report. I woke up in the clinic, and when I came out, it was all signed over to Ted. Next up was Jane Foster, owner of a construction company. Same pattern, same actors, same ending. Beatrice always played a key role, Jane said. She would deliberately drive her daughters-in-law to breakdowns and then play the caring mother-in-law who just wants to help the poor thing. Melissa Reed, third wife, lost a restaurant chain. Savannah worked the same scheme with me. Only back then her name was Crystal. She would purposely flirt with Ted in front of me and then deny everything, making me look paranoid. Savannah walked into the office, visibly thinner and slimmer. I'm ready to testify. Ted, he promised to marry me, make me a business partner. But I was just a tool. She described an elaborate scheme. Beatrice chose targets, successful women with their own businesses. Ted would study them, recognize their weaknesses. I would show up later, when I needed to create emotional pressure. The DA showed me the documents. These are Dr. Harris's reports, all the same template, same wording. He got a percentage of every deal. Rosie listened in silence. The picture was coming together completely. A years-long scheme, dozens of ruined lives, millions of stolen dollars. Beatrice was arrested at the airport while trying to fly out of the country. She kept a level head until the prosecutor laid out the documents about the origins of the Brookhaven fortune. Okay, I'll tell you everything, she snapped. It started when my husband was still alive. We went bankrupt in the 80s, but we needed to maintain our status in the community. Ted just carried on the family tradition. That evening, Rosie sat in her office looking through old photographs of their wedding. Now she saw things she hadn't noticed before. The calculating gleam in Ted's eyes, Beatrice's triumphant smile, the fake joy of the guests. She pulled out her journal and began to write. Today, I learned the truth about my marriage. It was never real. Just another play in a long series of plays. I was a target, a prey, another trophy in the collection of a con artist. The phone rang. Martha said that Ted was trying to make a deal with the investigation. Let him try, Rosie said calmly. We have enough evidence. The morning paper was on the table with the headline, The Marriage Swindler of the Century, the story of Theodore Brookhaven. Photographs of his victims, schemes of fraud, witness statements. Rosie closed the diary. It was time to start a new chapter, now her own real story. The courtroom was unusually quiet. Judge Michael Thompson, known for his intransigence in fraud cases, was reviewing the latest documents. Court is now in session, came the command. Ted, in his once immaculate but now rumpled suit, stood between the two policemen. There was no trace of his self-confidence left. The court, having considered all the evidence presented, finds Theodore James Brookhaven guilty of large-scale fraud, forgery of documents, financial fraud. The list of charges took almost 5 minutes. Rosie sat in the front row, calmly watching her ex-husband's empire of lies crumble. After the meeting, she was intercepted by IRS agent Catherine Duran. We're launching a full-scale investigation. All assets have been frozen, accounts seized. Looks like his frauds go back decades. In the Secular Chronicle, there was a notice that Beatrice Brookhaven hurriedly left the post of chairman of the charitable foundation. Her portrait was removed from the wall of the women's club, where she had chaired for 20 years. Old friends turned away. Invitations to receptions stopped. Savannah was smarter than everyone else. She disappeared a week before the verdict, having managed to withdraw almost $2 million from Ted's accounts. The last photo in her Instagram was taken on some tropical beach. The divorce process went quickly. Ted had no strength or ability to resist. All the assets fraudulently assigned to him were returned to their rightful owners. It's funny, Rosie told her lawyer. He tried so hard to take away my business and ended up losing everything himself. The press was full of headlines. Marriage scammer gets 15 years. Brookhaven empire collapses. Victims of fraudster get justice. Rosie was interviewed by leading business publications, telling her story, not as a victim, but as someone who was able to stand up to scammers and protect her business. The main thing I realized, she told a Forbes reporter, is that you can't let a pretty picture cloud your common sense, and you must always be ready to protect what you hold dear. Her boutiques were not only not affected by the scandal, but also gained new customers. The story of a strong woman who defeated fraudsters attracted the sympathy of the public. In the evening, sitting in her office, Rosie was reviewing documents about a new charitable project, a fund to help victims of financial abuse. Elizabeth, Jane, and Melissa had already agreed to join the board of directors. The phone rang. Martha was calling. "Turn on the news, Miss Rosie. Beatrice is testifying against her son." The former mother-in-law's face appeared on the screen, aged without the usual arrogance. "I plead guilty. Ted and I have been deceiving people for years." Rosie turned off the television and went to the window. Downstairs, Gerald the gardener was pruning the roses, the very ones Beatrice had tried to uproot, calling them vulgar. The phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Detective Reynolds. Found Dr. Harris, willing to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a deal. Rosie smiled. The circle had closed. Justice had been served. Now it was truly possible to start a new life. The first thing Rosie decided to do was to completely change the house. All the rooms where Beatrice and Savannah lived were renovated. Heavy drapes, which so loved mother-in-law, were replaced by light curtains. Antique furniture was taken away to auction, and the proceeds went to a charity fund to help victims of fraud. "Miss Rosie, where shall I put these roses?" Gerald brought in a huge basket of flowers. "In the living room," she smiled. "Let this house be filled with life and color." Ted's former office had become an art studio. Rosie had always wanted to paint, but her husband thought it was a waste of time. Now the easel by the window, paints and unfinished sketches created a very special atmosphere. In the evening, she often sat in the garden, remembering the events of the past year. Each day brought new lessons. She realized that for too long she had let others define her life, build boundaries, tell her what was right and what was wrong. "You know," she once said to Martha, "I'm grateful for this experience. It taught me to appreciate the real and to distinguish between falsity and sincerity." Gradually, old friendships were restored. Many had turned away from her during the scandal, believing Beatrice's gossip. Now they were returning, some with apologies, some with nothing. "I don't hold a grudge," Rosie said. "But I've become choosier about my friendships." Business was booming. After the story with Ted, many women trusted her brand. Rosie launched a new line of clothes, elegant yet comfortable for confident women. "We don't just sell things," she explained at a staff meeting. "We help women feel strong and beautiful." One day, a man walked into her boutique, tall with kind eyes and a slight gray on his temples. Michael Andrews, a professor of architecture, was looking for a gift for his sister. "I don't know anything about fashion," he admitted embarrassedly. They talked for 2 hours. He talked about old buildings, she about fabrics and design. A week later, he invited her to a contemporary art exhibition. "You're unlike any other man I've ever met," Rosie said after their third date. "I hope that's a compliment," he smiled. Their relationship developed slowly, without hurry. Michael didn't try to control her life or interfere with her business. He was just there, reliable, sincere, real. Reconciliation with the past came unexpectedly. Rosie accidentally saw a news story about Ted, gaunt in a prison uniform. He testified against his accomplices. "You know," she said to Michael, "I don't feel anger or resentment anymore, only pity for a man who built a life on lies. A year after all the events, Rosie threw a big reception at her house, but now everything was different. Sincere smiles, real friends, a warm atmosphere. Elizabeth, Jane, and Melissa, Ted's ex-wives, had become her close friends. Their charitable foundation had already helped dozens of women get out of toxic relationships. To a new life, Rosie raised her glass. Michael squeezed her hand gently. The roses that Beatrice wanted to destroy bloomed in the garden. There was laughter in the house. On the table were sketches of a new collection and plans for expanding the business. Epilogue. 1 year later, Rosie stood at the window of her office watching the sun go down. On the desk was the latest issue of Forbes with her picture on the cover. Woman of the Year, a story of success and revival. Downstairs, Michael was playing with their new puppy, a golden retriever named Charlie. A simple but elegant engagement ring glistened on Rosie's finger, no flashy diamonds, just sincerity of feeling. The phone rang. Martha was calling. "Turn on the news. Beatrice Brookhaven has admitted to all the charges." But Rosie only smiled and shook her head. It didn't matter anymore. Her life had long ago taken a different path. A bright, honest, real one. She opened her day planner and wrote, "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself. I am grateful for this experience. It has made me stronger. But most importantly, it taught me the value of true happiness." Michael waved to her from the garden. Charlie barked happily, and fresh roses bloomed in a vase on the table, a symbol of the new life that was just beginning. For Rosie, this experience was a path to true freedom. She realized that a woman's strength is not in status or marriage, but in her ability to stay true to herself. Each loss turned out to be a gain. Having lost a false love, she gained a real one. Having lost illusions, she found the truth. Ted, finding himself behind bars, faced the emptiness of his own life for the first time. All his victories turned to dust, and the art of manipulation was powerless in the face of justice. In the silence of the prison cell, he realized that in destroying other people's lives, he had destroyed his own. Beatrice had lost everything she held dear: her status, her reputation, the respect of society. Her arrogance turned to loneliness, and her desire to control her son led to his downfall. In exile, she finally realized the futility of social ambition and the price of true values. Savannah, absconding with the stolen money, got what she sought: wealth. But the price was high: perpetual flight, inability to return, and fear of exposure. Her clever plan turned into a golden cage. Martha and the rest of the servants proved that loyalty and honesty are stronger than money and status. Their simple wisdom and humanity proved more reliable than social connections and ostentatious wealth. And the house that had become a battlefield took on a new life of sincerity and warmth instead of falsity and intrigue. Every room, every corner of the garden seemed to be cleansed of the dark past, blossoming towards the future. This story showed that every betrayal can be followed by rebirth, every loss by gain, and every lie is followed by truth. You just need to find the strength to face it with an open heart.